Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive on a topic that I think we can all relate to in one way or another.
Absolutely.
Covert narcissism, and we're really going to unpack some fascinating research on this.
Yeah.
And some real-world examples.
Yeah, when most people think of narcissism, they think of that over-the-top egotistical,
Right.
that person that's, like the subject of Carly Simon's "You're So Vain."
Aha, the classic always looking in the mirror.
Right,
But
exactly.
today we're focusing on a different breed, the vulnerable narcissist.
Yeah.
They might not fit that, flamboyant stereotype.
Right.
But trust me, they could be just as impactful in our lives, maybe even more so because they fly under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, and that's such a good point because it's like two sides of the same coin. On one side you have your grandiose narcissist
Right?
who's outwardly confident,
Yeah.
always seeking the spotlight. They're often actually quite well adjusted mentally.
They seem to be living their best life, right on the surface, at least.
Yeah.
What about the vulnerable narcissist, then? How do they differ?
Well, vulnerable narcissists are much more complex.
Okay.
They crave that same social status and admiration as the grandiose type,
Right.
but deep down they're riddled with insecurity and hypersensitivity
Okay.
to any kind of criticism.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's almost like a,
It's almost paradoxical.
yeah, paradox. I was going to say counterintuitive, right?
Yeah,
You wouldn't think someone who wants all this validation would also be so fragile.
right.
How does that play out, then, in the real world?
So think about it this way. The vulnerable narcissist feels they haven't been given the recognition they deserve.
Okay.
And this can lead to feelings of resentment and passive-aggressive behavior.
So they're not going to be, shouting their accomplishments from the rooftops.
No, not at all.
Okay.
In fact, they might be more withdrawn and self-deprecating.
Interesting.
But underneath that facade is a deep need to be seen as special and superior.
Okay, so let's say I'm trying to spot a vulnerable narcissist in my own life.
Sure.
What should I be looking for?
Absolutely.
Are there any telltale signs?
So while it's not about diagnosing anyone, our research does point to some red flags. For example, imagine you have a colleague who seems perfectly pleasant to your face,
Yeah.
but then subtly undermines you behind your back, maybe taking credit for your ideas or spreading rumors.
That's sneaky. So it's like a passive-aggressive.
Exact
Right.
power play.
Yeah, passive-aggressive power play. Gotcha.
Workplace environments can be a breeding ground for this kind of covert narcissism.
Okay.
The competitive atmosphere can fuel those feelings of inadequacy and resentment.
And because they're not being outwardly arrogant, it's harder to pinpoint
Right.
what's going on.
Exactly.
People might even feel sorry for them.
Right. And they might play the victim,
Oh, God.
making you feel like you're the way, being insensitive.
Oh, wow.
It can be very confusing.
So how do we distinguish between someone who's genuinely having a hard time and someone who's just using that vulnerability as a tactic?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy to discern, but one thing to look for is a pattern of behavior.
Okay.
Is this person consistently undermining others
Right.
or playing the victim in various situations?
So consistency is key.
Yes.
Gotcha. So let's move beyond the workplace. What about in social settings? How might a vulnerable narcissist behave?
Well, one thing to watch out for is how they gather information.
Okay.
They might seem overly interested in your personal life, asking a lot of probing questions.
Right.
But then later, they might use that information against you, either to gossip or to make themselves look better by comparison.
Oh, so it's like they're always collecting ammunition
Exactly.
in case they need to use it later.
Yeah.
You're saying we should be cautious then about what we reveal to these people.
It's always wise to be mindful of who you share personal information with,
True.
especially if you sense that someone might not have your best interests at heart.
Okay, so we've talked about the workplace, we've talked about social situations, let's dive into
For
relationships.
sure.
How does vulnerable narcissism manifest in a romantic context?
Oh, this can be particularly tricky because it often involves a lot of push and pull.
Okay.
The vulnerable narcissist might initially present as very needy and dependent, showering you with attention and affection.
So they reel you in with that vulnerability.
Precisely. But as the relationship progresses, that neediness can morph into controlling and manipulative behavior.
Gotcha.
They might try to isolate you from your friends and family, make you feel guilty for spending time on your own interests, or constantly criticize you to undermine your confidence.
So it's like they need you to constantly reassure them of their worth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're trying to diminish your worth to maintain a sense of superiority.
Exactly. It's a very complex dynamic.
Yeah.
And it can be incredibly damaging to the other person in the relationship.
One of the things I think is interesting, too, is that they don't typically brag or boast
No.
about themselves. They're much more likely to downplay their achievements and focus on their struggles.
Right.
Why is that? If they're so desperate for admiration, wouldn't they want to flaunt their succession?
It all comes back to that deep-seated insecurity.
Right.
They're terrified of being exposed as frauds or failures, so they protect themselves by appearing humble and self-effacing.
Interesting.
It's a way of controlling the narrative and managing other people's perceptions of them.
So it's all a very carefully constructed facade.
In many ways, yes, and that's what makes them so difficult to deal with. You're
Right.
never quite sure what's genuine and what's part of the act.
And this is where I think the science of a narcissist's brain really comes into play.
Okay.
Our research highlighted a fascinating study where researchers measured the heart rate responses of vulnerable narcissists
Uh-huh.
as they watched a woman sharing an emotional story.
Oh, wow.
And I have to admit, when I first read about this, I was blown away by the results.
Really, what stood out to you the most?
Initially, the narcissist's heart rates actually slowed down while watching this story,
Okay.
which is a physiological indicator of low empathy.
So almost as if they were shutting down emotionally.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. When the researchers instructed the narcissists to try to take the woman's perspective,
Okay.
their heart rates sped up to normal levels.
So implying that they do have the capacity for empathy,
Right.
but they're not readily accessing it.
So it's not that they're completely devoid of empathy. It's more like they're choosing to not engage with it.
That's a very insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it challenges some of the traditional beliefs about narcissism.
Right.
It suggests that empathy might be more of a skill or a muscle that can be developed rather than an innate quality that some people simply lack.
That's mind-blowing to me.
Right.
But it also makes you wonder then, what's driving that choice? Why wouldn't they want to tap into it?
Well, one theory is that it's simply easier to get what we want without emotional interference.
Okay?
Empathy can be messy and inconvenient.
Yeah.
It requires you to consider other people's feelings and needs,
Right?
which can get in the way of achieving your own goals.
So empathy is almost a liability in their minds.
It's possible, but it's important to remember that this is just one study, and more research is needed to fully understand the complex interplay of factors at play.
Well, this has been an incredible start to our deep dive.
I agree.
We've unpacked the key differences between grandiose and vulnerable narcissists.
Yeah,
We've learned how to spot some potential red flags in various situations.
right.
And even delved into the fascinating science behind a narcissist's brain.
Yes, it's been a very productive discussion so far.
There's so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah, we've only just scratched the surface.
Up next, we're going to delve into the age-old question of nature versus nurture. Are narcissists born or are they made?
Stay tuned to find out.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork for understanding vulnerable narcissism, but there's another layer to this I find fascinating.
Yeah,
It's that whole nature versus nurture debate.
right.
Are narcissists born this way, or are they shaped by their environment?
That's a question that has puzzled researchers for decades. And the answer, as with most things in psychology, is not black and white.
Okay.
Our sources suggest that both genetics and environment play significant roles.
So it's not a case of either or,
Exactly.
but rather a complex interplay
Yeah.
of both.
Yeah, while some individuals may have a genetic predisposition towards certain personality traits,
Right.
those traits are ultimately expressed and molded by their experiences,
Right.
especially in childhood.
That makes sense. We talked earlier about how early experiences shape our personalities. Are there specific childhood experiences that might contribute to developing narcissism?
Our research highlights a few key factors. For example, when children are consistently overpraised for being special or superior to others,
Okay.
it can foster a sense of entitlement and grandiosity.
So instead of praising effort and resilience, the focus is solely on outcomes and achievements.
Right, the child learns that their worth is contingent upon external validation rather than internal qualities.
Gotcha.
And this can set the stage for narcissistic tendencies later in life.
What about the flip side then? What kind of childhood experiences might lead to vulnerable narcissism
Okay.
with all that insecurity and hypersensitivity?
Well, inconsistent parenting seems to play a significant role here. Imagine a child who is showered with attention and praise 1 minute, but then criticized and belittled the next.
Yeah.
This creates a very unstable sense of self.
Yeah, that must be so confusing for a child. They're constantly trying to figure out what they need to do to please their parents
Exactly.
and earn their love.
And that can lead to a deep-seated fear of rejection and a constant need for reassurance,
Right.
which in turn can manifest as vulnerable narcissism in adulthood.
As you're describing this, I can't help but think about societal influences as well.
Yeah.
Could our culture, with its emphasis on individual achievement and social media validation,
Right.
be contributing to the rise of narcissism?
That's a really interesting question, and one that researchers are starting to explore more deeply. Some experts believe that our hyper-competitive culture, coupled with the constant pressure to present a perfect image online,
Right.
may be exacerbating narcissistic tendencies.
It makes sense. We're constantly bombarded with messages about success, beauty, and popularity.
Right.
It's easy to feel like we're not measuring up.
And when our sense of self-worth is tied to external validation,
Right?
it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
We're always chasing that next, or compliment, never feeling truly satisfied.
So it's not just about parenting styles or individual experiences. There might be these larger cultural forces at play here as well.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations.
Yeah.
And to raise awareness about the complexities of narcissism. It's not just about pointing fingers at individuals.
Right.
It's about understanding the systemic factors that might be contributing to this phenomenon.
You've mentioned this idea of a narcissism spectrum a few times. Can
Yeah.
you elaborate on that?
Sure, it's important to remember that narcissism isn't an all-or-nothing trait.
Okay.
It exists on a continuum, with everyone falling somewhere along that spectrum.
So we all have some degree of narcissism within us.
To a certain extent, yes, healthy narcissism is actually essential for self-esteem and motivation.
Okay.
It allows us to set goals, strive for success, and believe in our own abilities.
How do we distinguish then between healthy narcissism and the kind that becomes problematic?
It's all about balance and degrees. When narcissistic traits become excessive and start to interfere with our relationships and overall well-being, that's when it becomes a concern.
So there's a difference between having confidence and feeling entitled
Exactly.
to special treatment.
That's a crucial distinction to make, and it's also important to remember that narcissism can manifest differently in different people.
Right.
There are many subtypes of narcissism, each with its unique set of characteristics.
This whole conversation about the spectrum of narcissism reminds me of something you mentioned earlier. The idea of contextual narcissism. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Of course, contextual narcissism refers to the idea that narcissistic traits can ebb and flow depending on the situation.
So someone might act in a narcissistic way in one context,
Yes.
but not another.
Precisely. Think about a colleague who's very competitive and cutthroat at work, but then at home they're loving and supportive with their family.
Or someone who's very outgoing and attention-seeking
Right.
in social situations, but then more reserved and introspective in one-on-one conversation.
Exactly. It's all about how different environments can trigger or suppress certain personality traits.
So it's not necessarily that the person is a narcissist in the clinical sense, but rather that the situation is bringing out those tendencies.
Right. And that's an important nuance to consider when we're trying to understand and navigate relationships with people who exhibit these traits.
Sounds like context is key.
Absolutely. We can't just label someone as a narcissist based on a single interaction or observation. We need to consider the broader context and look for patterns of behavior over time.
This brings up another interesting point.
Okay.
How do we actually measure narcissistic traits? Is there a reliable way to assess where someone falls on that spectrum?
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
But there are some assessment tools that psychologists use, like the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, or NPI, which you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
It's a questionnaire with 40 forced-choice questions that measure various aspects of narcissism,
Okay.
such as vanity, entitlement, and a need for admiration.
So you're presented with two statements, and you have to choose the one that best reflects your personality.
Exactly. And based on your responses, you get a score that gives you a general idea of your level of narcissistic traits.
That's interesting. It sounds like a useful tool for self-reflection as well.
Uh-huh.
Even if you're not concerned about having a narcissistic personality disorder,
Right.
it might be helpful to get a sense of where you fall on that spectrum.
I agree. Self-awareness is always beneficial, especially when it comes to understanding our own strengths and weaknesses.
As we're talking about assessment tools and diagnosis, I can't help but think about all the misconceptions that surround narcissism. It seems like it's become a bit of a buzzword these days. Anyone who does something selfish or inconsiderate is labeled a narcissist.
That's a great point, and it's important to remember that narcissism is a complex and nuanced phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's not simply about being self-centered or egotistical.
Right.
It's a deeply ingrained personality trait with many layers.
So it's not just a matter of checking off a few boxes on a personality test.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to avoid diagnosing people casually.
Right.
If you're concerned about someone's behavior, it's always best to consult with a qualified mental health professional.
Well, this has been an incredibly illuminating discussion so far.
Yes, it has.
We've explored the nature versus nurture debate, delved into the idea of a narcissism spectrum and contextual narcissism,
Yeah.
and even touched upon the importance of responsible diagnosis.
It's been a fascinating journey into the complexities of human behavior,
Yeah.
and there's still so much more to explore.
Exactly. Up next, we'll tackle a question that's on a lot of pickers' minds. Can narcissists change?
Right.
Is there hope for those who find themselves in relationships with these individuals?
Stay tuned to find out.
So we've talked about spotting vulnerable narcissists and their roots, But the big question is, can they change?
Yeah, that's the question everyone wants answered.
Is there hope for them?
No.
And for the people in relationships with them?
And it's a question that's caused, a lot of debate among researchers, therapists,
Yeah.
Because narcissism is such a deeply ingrained personality trait,
Right.
you know?
Often rooted in those early childhood experiences we talked about.
Right. So
So to completely rewire those thought patterns, those behavioral patterns,
it's a tough one.
it's like an uphill battle.
Yeah, and our sources suggest that, eradicating narcissism might be a, a long shot,
Right.
especially without professional intervention.
Okay.
However,
Mhm.
there is a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
While transforming the personality may be unrealistic, there's increasing evidence that we can focus on increasing empathy.
Wait, so even though those tendencies might always be kind of lurking there
Yeah,
underneath is what you're saying,
yeah,
there's a chance that someone can learn to be more empathetic,
exactly.
even if they have those tendencies.
Like, think back to that study with the heart rate responses.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how the vulnerable narcissists showed initially low empathy, but then when prompted to take the woman's perspective, their heart rates normalized?
So it was like they had the ability,
Right.
but just weren't using it.
Right. It suggests that for some people with these traits, empathy might be more of a skill that can be developed.
Okay.
Almost like a muscle that needs training.
That's a really interesting way to look at it, but how do you go about training someone's empathy muscle if they don't see a need for it?
Right.
I mean, wouldn't they just resist the whole idea?
It's a challenge, but our sources do highlight some promising approaches.
Okay.
One key is to avoid framing it as fixing the narcissist.
Okay.
Instead, you appeal to their self-interest.
You speak their language.
Exactly. So, for example, instead of saying you need to be more empathetic,
Right.
you might say, developing empathy is a key skill for successful leaders.
Okay.
Or being more attuned to your partner's feelings will strengthen your relationship.
So you highlight the benefits of empathy,
Yeah.
how it can help them.
Exactly. You're showing them that empathy isn't just some touchy-feely concept.
Right.
It's a practical tool
Yeah.
that can help them get what they want.
Oh, that's smart. But I imagine that takes
Oh, yeah.
a lot of patience
It's delicate.
and finesse.
Absolutely. And in many cases, professional guidance is essential.
Right.
A therapist can provide that safe and supportive space to explore those issues and develop healthier patterns.
So it might not be easy, but
Right.
there's a possibility
There's a possibility,
of change.
especially with the right support.
It's encouraging.
Yeah, and remember, even small shifts in empathy can make a big difference in the lives of those around the narcissist,
Yeah.
as well as their own.
So we've talked about that, but how do we protect ourselves in the meantime in these relationships?
Right, that's essential, and one of the most important things you can do is set firm boundaries.
Okay.
This means clearly communicating what behavior you will and will not tolerate,
Right.
and then consistently enforcing those boundaries.
So regardless of how they react,
Exactly.
you are taking control.
You can't control their behavior, but you can control how you respond to it.
Yeah.
Remember, you deserve to be treated with respect, and you don't have to tolerate abuse or manipulation.
That's such an important message for people
It is.
to hear, because sometimes it's easy to get caught up in
Right.
trying to please them, but ultimately
Right.
protecting ourselves is the priority.
I couldn't agree more. And sometimes the healthiest option may be to distance yourself from the relationship entirely.
Right.
Especially if it's causing you significant emotional harm.
Before we go, I think it's also important to remember
Yeah,
that we should be doing some self-reflection here as well.
absolutely.
Before we start labeling others as narcissists,
Right.
we should take a look at the mirror.
We've all exhibited narcissistic traits at times. It's part of the human experience.
So recognizing those tendencies in ourselves
Yeah,
and striving to be more aware and empathetic
exactly.
in our interactions with others.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we understand about narcissism,
Right.
both of ourselves and others, the better equipped we are to navigate.
The complexities of human relationship.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a real eye-opener for me. I hope it has been for you too.
I hope so.
We've uncovered the subtle world of covert narcissism, explored the science behind it,
Yeah.
and even grappled with the tough question of whether real change is possible.
It's been
We'd
fascinating.
love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Have you encountered covert narcissism in your own life?
Yeah.
What insights resonated with you the most? Head over to our social media pages and share your thoughts using the episode hashtag.
Yes, we're eager to continue this conversation and learn from your experiences.
As always, stay curious.
And stay informed.